This might actually be the intro. Oh boy. Harry Truman, Doris Day, Red China, Johnny Ray, South Pacific, Walter Winchell, Joe Domingo, Joe McCarthy, Richard Nixon, Studebaker, Television, North Korea, South Korea, Marilyn Monroe. Hello! Welcome to another McMurdo video. This was not going to be the intro, this was going to be a test, but I got so hyped up by that banger of a song I thought we might as well jump right in. So, it's been a while, I've got a German mug, too long, I would say. But anyway, April, I think, was the last time. And how things have changed, huh? I finished school. I'm going off to university next year, doing a Bachelor in Arts. I mean, who knows what could happen? We've had a scene change. We've got a desk now. We've got books. Sadly, you won't be able to see all the great things on the wall anymore. Might have to sort that out. But anyway, so we didn't start the fire. The epic 1989 song by Billy Joel. I want to dissect every single reference within this banger of a tune, and this is going to be part one, because I'm going to try and do it without any prior research. And then part two, I'll go away and look at every single thing and then come back with a boring old thingamabob. Anyway, so, without further ado, we start off with Harry Truman. So, I haven't looked at the lyrics. Well, I've never looked at the lyrics until now, and I haven't listened to the song for a very long time, except a few minutes ago, and then just that first section there, which we were just listening to. Harry Truman was, first off, Vice President of the USA, and then he became President of the USA after the death of FDR in 1945. I'm not really sure what this video is going to be. I think I'm just trying to have a bit of a rant about historical figures and social things, which should be fun. Anyway, Harry Truman. Yes, he was vice president to FDR. He became president after FDR died. He led America during the closing years, or the closing year of the Second World War. He was the one who authorized the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was the one who said yes to dropping the bomb. He represented America at a bunch of very important conferences in the later stages of World War II. Like, was he at Potsdam? See, this is when my research. I'm just going to be rambling. So, was he at Potsdam? I think he wasn't at Yalta. He might have been at Potsdam. Anyway, that's Harry Truman. Did he win an election? I think he did win an election in his own right. Was it 1946 or 7? He won an election in his own right, and then I think he served one term. Or did he serve 2 terms? I don't know. Anyway, I do know, however, that the 2-term limit thing got put in because FDR was in for too long, and all the bloody right-wing bloody Republicans were too scared of him becoming a bloody commie, bloody dictator, which, you know, he was doing things with the government, so obviously he's a communist. Moving on, Doris Day. I have no idea who Doris Day is. It rings a bell. She's probably a singer. Doris Day. Yeah, some mid-20th century celebrity singer lady who's probably American and probably very attractive. Red China, probably referring to communist China, I would imagine. So you had the Chinese Civil War, which began in the 1920s with the commies under Mao versus the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, I think his name is. And so they were battling out, and then the Japs came in, and they kind of went wow, pow, pow in the Second World War. And so then the commies and the nationalists stopped fighting. And we're like, well, maybe we should, fight against these Japanese people. Perhaps that would be a good idea. What do you think, Mao? What do you think? Chiang Kai-shek, I think his name is. So they stopped fighting, they fought the Japanese, and the Japanese beat them quite badly in the beginning, but then, of course, going back to Harry Truman, the bombs came along, and the Japanese were out of there, and then the Chinese could start fighting again. So Mao, eventually, there was the Long March, I think, is that a thing from history? And it was like, my Chinese history is very bad. It was like hundreds of thousands of red Chinese soldiers marching against the nationalists on this big long march, and there was a battle, and anyway, years and years and years passed. I think it was in 1949 that the Red Chinese finally beat the nationalists, and the nationalists evacuated to Taiwan, which is interesting because today Taiwan is seen as its own country, but Taiwan is actually equally as much has a claim to China, just as much as China has a claim to China, because China is really just communist China, and Taiwan is really just, well, it was nationalist China, but now it's a fully fledged democratic state as far as I'm concerned, which is why Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party at the moment are so concerned with Taiwan and want to wipe it off the map and invade it, which of course then America wants to help Taiwan. It's the South Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific region is really it's the melting pot of geopolitical strategic issues of our day and age. And if there's going to be a war which will come, personally I think it will be over Taiwan, around Taiwan. Which leads to fascinating questions. Because it's 2021, it's almost 2022. What the hell is war going to look like? We haven't had a proper war between major nations since 1945 on a large scale. And so, I mean, you've got China and the USA in the West versus China over Taiwan. I mean, what will that even look like? The online the technological potential of people wiping out whole server systems of the American intelligentsia or the Chinese Air Force. It would be a terrible atrocity. I don't think any nukes would be dropped, because that would, goodbye to McMurdo and goodbye to a lot more else. But it would be such a fascinating war to observe and not be in. Which is always the thing with war, isn't it? God, this song is going to strew down lots of existential thoughts. Johnny Ray. So Harry Truman, Doris Day, Red China, Johnny Ray. I have no idea who Johnny Ray is. Up there with Doris Day, obviously. Doris Day, Johnny Ray. Maybe they're married, who knows. Johnny Ray, again, I don't know, politician, entertainer, social, I don't know. South Pacific is, of course, a region in the Pacific Ocean. But there's also a musical, I'm pretty sure, called South Pacific, by the same people who do West Side Story and Oklahoma, I think. What are they called again? Bernstein Brothers? Oh, I'm clutching it. I did musicals in year 10, and we covered South Pacific, I think. And pardon me, I can't. But yeah, it's South Pacific. If this is related to the musical, and there's like a plantation. I think there's a plantation, and then someone on the plantation falls in love with the plantation owner, and then they have to escape away. I think. I don't know. Let's move on from South Pacific. Walter Winchell, again, no idea. Joe DiMaggio. Now that is a last name. DiMaggio. Joe DiMaggio. No idea who he is. Joe McCarthy, I would suppose, is probably relating to Joseph McCarthy. I think? Is that? Yeah, Senator Joseph McCarthy? Yeah, McCarthyism, yeah. Yeah, so Joe McCarthy, if this is Senator Joseph McCarthy, was a Republican senator in Wisconsin from 1947 to 1957. And he was one of the major figures in the Hollywood blacklists and hunting down supposed communists in the Second Red Scare in America. So the Second Red Scare came after the end of World War II, when everyone in America was like, Stalin still has troops in all of Eastern Europe and he hasn't left yet. And China, communist China, just won the Chinese Civil War, and look, there's lots of spies in our government. And then in 1949, it was like, the USSR has a nuclear bomb. Maybe we should worry about this. And so Joe McCarthy, yeah, I'm sure that, but I feel like there needs to be an A. Anyway, and then Joe McCarthy, the Republican guy, was like, yeah, we're getting all these commies and all of our different things, and we're gonna find them all, and then this whole social mob mentality phenomenon appeared within American society, and it was horrendous. In fact, if you look at The Crucible, which is a brilliant play written by Arthur Miller, who's a brilliant playwright. If you look at The Crucible, there he is. Look at that fine young man. Those glasses. Honestly, fashion just isn't what it was. So if you look at that, that's about the Salem witch trials, and it's a complete allegory for the hunting down of supposed communists in America in the 50s and the 60s, and a bit in the 70s. So, and it was a whole thing. So there would be there was the HUAC. Let's get this right. The House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee, which would pretty much request people to come before this public committee. It was pretty much a public trial, and they would ask them, "Are you a communist?" Because someone else has said you're a communist. Are you a communist? And if you say no, well then obviously you're a communist, so you have to be taken away to prison, or your passport's cancelled, or something terrible has happened. So you're, or if you say yes, I am a communist, and then you point at someone else and pull someone else in and claim someone else to be a communist, then you get out free. So it was pretty much just this massive, mostly false witch hunt of nervous and scared Americans creating this systematic fear within American society to prop themselves up, really, which isn't very good. And the same was happening in Salem, in Massachusetts, in 1692, in the Salem witch trials. See, I studied The Crucible in this year. Like, I did an exam on it not that long ago, so this is why I know so much about Joe McCarthy. I'm not really that smart. And so the Salem witch trials was the same thing, where there was paranoia about witches, and if you and you're brought before the court, and if you say that you're not a witch, then obviously you're a witch, so you get hanged, and then if you say that you are a witch, and then you claim, or if you say that you've been under the possession of witches, or you've been influenced by witches or wizards, because they always avoided that. Because there were male people, I don't know why, male people were accused, like the legendary John Proctor, who I quite like that character. I think that's one of the greatest characters, one of the greatest protagonists of literature I see in John Proctor as a character with faults and problems and terrible problems and terrible humanity, but he's so genuine, and he deeply means to do well, and holds on to his ideas no matter the cost, and won't bend to societal pressure, and ends up paying for it with his life. God, I'll have to put Crucible spoilers warning on this now. Anyway, so where was I? Joe McCarthy. Yeah, Republican, hated commies. Moving on. Richard Nixon. I don't know that much about Nixon. He was a Republican as well. Watergate. He was a Republican. Pretty sure he got 2 terms. He was around during the 60s. I'm pretty sure. Was it the 70s? Late 60s, early 70s. I'm gonna guess. I'm not the best on American political history. So he was a Republican. He had like that really floppy jaw. He did the whole like but you can't see it because the camera's stupid. And he was a good lad, old Nixon. So the Watergate scandal. Actually, I think that comes up later in the song. So Richard Nixon. Was it Nixon or Reagan? It was Nixon with the Watergate scandal. So Nixon actually resigned. I think he is the only president. I think he was getting impeached, and then he resigned before he was impeached. And I think, to date, he is the only president who's ever resigned with the presidency. I think. Anyway, that's Nixon. Republican. Studebaker. if I've pronounced that right, comes after Nixon. No idea who Studebaker is. If it could be a thing, it could be a person. Television comes after Studebaker. Old Billy Joel just says television. And television, it's a funny one. It's kind of underrated, really, isn't it? Because it's a crazy concept. The fact that, around mid-60s, in Western nations, that you now had a box in your house that could project a moving picture from miles and miles and miles and miles away, and you could consume information and entertainment and comedy and news and opinion and documentary and thought and ideas and beauty, all from this little box in your room, and millions and millions and millions of people could be watching exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. It was mind-boggling, really, if you think about it. And now we just take it for granted, but television, man, that was the stuff. It really was. It was kind of the beginning of, like, the invasion. I've got to be careful here. It was kind of the beginning of the invasion of the home, really. Because you had radio, but television was one step further than radio in relation to breaking the barrier of the home. Because the home, the unit of the family within Western society and the unit of the house and the home had, up until the invention of television, I would argue, just off the top of my head right now, had been quite secure. You could come and knock on the door, and you could have normal human interaction, which was fine, which was normal. But you would always, you'd sit down and you'd have your Sunday lunch, or you'd sit down and you'd have your normal dinner, or you could live a happy private life which was family interconnected and family based, or based, if you were a kid or a teenager, based within friends around your local block. And then of course you had radio, which came in, and then so the parents would turn on the radio or something in the afternoon or in the morning, and you'd listen into the news or whatever. But I feel like radio wasn't as not addictive, but it didn't capture people as much as television was able to, and it also didn't capture children as much as television was able to, in ways of entertainment. And so radio was there, but when television came in, it now became very easy for that home unit to be infiltrated by a box which would show information and entertainment, which could then rupture that family structure. And I'm sounding quite grandiose and almost not metaphysical, but quite grandiose. But at the end of the day, it's true that up until that point, you'd never had a box in your house which you could turn on at, not any point in time back then, but at most points in time, and you could be entertained and encapsulated, and you wouldn't have to interact with anyone else around your house, or you wouldn't have to sit down and go to the effort of reading a book. Because there are two other more things with television, is that it's very easy to enjoy. It's a very one-way street. It's a very one-way relationship. As in, the television does all the work, and you sit there and enjoy it. If you're talking to your family, or you're playing a board game, or you're playing with your friends, or you're reading a book, or you're doing the crossword, it's more of a symbiotic relationship in which both sides benefit of, or at least it takes more effort. If you're reading a book or doing the crossword, there's mental, strenuous activity there. But when you're watching television, that kind of erodes. It really does. And then advertising as well. I suppose you had advertising on radio, but advertising in television, I feel like, was a massive shift. Because of now that there was the visual stimuli, you could use colour, you could use logos, you could use funny people, you could use laughing tracks, You could use all these different things. I would argue that television, it was fundamental in the creation of consumerism and consumer culture, relating to the fact that people had to purchase televisions themselves, and then televisions throughout adverts would be this box which would then promote further consumerism and further worship of celebrities and further easy access to information. And it was almost, perhaps you could say, the beginning of this insane communicational revolution which Western society and now Eastern society has been going through for decades and decades and decades now, of information being accessible to everyone incredibly quickly, at the touch of your phone, at the touch of your iPad, at the touch of your computer screen. Millions and millions and literally millions of websites and millions of hours of YouTube. I mean, it's insane that 100 years ago, hell, even 70 years ago, or 60 years ago, none of that was available. You would walk to your local library. You would have a bookcase in your house with the same good old history books and Encyclopedia Britannica, and you would talk to your teachers and your friends, and you would live in a singular community. And life was so much more simple, and some would say enjoyable. And then you had the beginning of television and radio, and that progressed and progressed through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, until you've got with what we've got today, with such an overload of information in our culture. And it's almost like people don't know what to do with it. All this information. So much information that it creates laziness, I would argue. Because it creates laziness because there's so much available. You know, one, you can look at all of it, get scared and give up. Or two, you can try to go looking, but then you find lots of thin lines of information about sporadic subjects, and you don't really get into the nitty-gritty detail of specific informational topics. And you don't sit down and enjoy a book. You listen to the latest 15-minute podcast or something, or the latest YouTube video. And perhaps television was the beginning of that. The beginning of the invasion of the Western household, and the beginning of this high-speed information culture that we now live in. No. Moving on. After television comes North Korea, South Korea, Marilyn Monroe. So North Korea and South Korea are two current nation states residing on the Korean Peninsula. Who would have guessed? Korean Peninsula, if you want to know, it is east of China, west of Japan. It even borders a little bit of Russia to the north. It's divided along is it the 57th parallel or the 59th parallel? I think is where the demilitarized zone is, between North Korea and South Korea. Anyway, so this goes back to the Chinese Civil War, which I was talking about before. I think, actually, I'm not too sure about this one. Oh well, I'll try to explain. Was it? So China was taken over by the communists, and I'm going to have to be corrected here. And then Korea in the early 20th century was colonized by Japan, and Japan invaded Korea, and they then went on to Manchuria and then into China. But Korea was invaded by the Japanese in the early 20th century and remained under Japanese control for many, many years. And then, of course, World War II came, the Japanese were pushed out of Korea. And then what happened was, after the Japanese left, I'm not sure if there was then a fully Korean state, and then the communist Chinese invaded supported by the USSR, and then push the South Koreans back, or what happened was it was a bit like Germany, and the Communist Chinese and the USSR came in from the north, pushing the Japanese out of the north, and then the Allies and America came in from the south. I can't remember. Anyway, one of those two happened, I'm pretty sure. And what ended up happening was that the north, with the communists, pushed further and further and further south, and then it became apparent to the west that the Korean peninsula was going to be completely communist, and they didn't want that. So Chairman Mao and Stalin at that point in time had put in Kim Il-sung. I think he was Kim Il-sung, and then Kim Sung-il. Oh, I can't remember I always forget what the second one was. And then, of course, now we're on Kim Jong-un. But they put the first North Korean dictator into North Korea, and they're pushing further and further into South Korea. And then the West realized, holy moly, we should probably do something about this. So, early mid-50s, the Korean War began. And so America, Britain, allied nations went in to defend South Korea. And they were led by General McCarthy, who had his corncob pipe. He's a bit of a lad. And they went in, and they were fighting, and eventually what happened was the West in the South pushed the communists back up to the 59th or the 57th parallel, which is pretty much one of the lines of latitude around the world, which pretty much slices the Korean peninsula in half, and they pushed them back to there. And then I think MacArthur got a bit ahead of himself and decided to push further into the Korean peninsula, and eventually the communists then started to push back, and there was like a stalemate developed along the 57th or the 59th parallel, and to this day, South Korea and it hasn't been resolved. So to this day, South Korea and North Korea are still technically at war, with of course the West supporting the South, and North Korea. It's fascinating because in the immediate period after the Korean War, North Korea was actually incredibly prosperous, and South Korea was incredibly desolate. So the capitalist economy in the South hadn't kicked up yet, and of course the communist economy in the North was being pumped full of money by the Russians and the Chinese, and it was booming. And now, if you look at it, it's completely the other way around. The South is an economic powerhouse, one of the fastest developing economies in the world. And the North is an economic mess, thanks to our Lord and Savior Kim Jong-un and his centralized economic planning. And part of North Korea's decline is due to the fact of communism's decline in general around the world. So when the USSR collapsed in 1991, because of old Gooby and Reagan and a few others, what ended up happening was that quite a lot of money going into North Korea was then shut off. And then they had some famines, as communist nations like to do, and then their economy started to stagnate. I don't think they have a plethora of natural resources. They have quite a large population. And of course they've just got the degrading social effects of communist ideology, which inhibits prosperity, in my view. Does North Korea and South Korea. It's an interesting one, because I wonder, like, it's going to be interesting to see when the Korean peninsula is resolved, when it sorts itself out, because it hasn't yet, and it probably won't for a very long time. So we'll have to see. I mean, Trump tried to, he didn't do it very well. He got further than a lot of other people. That was actually one perhaps major step of Trump's foreign policy in relation to the Korean peninsula. And then the North Koreans and the South Koreans played on like the same ice hockey team or the same ping pong team in the 2000 and 18 Winter Olympics in Seoul, in the capital of South Korea. Yeah. Oh, another thing about North Korea, because each communist nation kind of has their own brand of communism. If you look at like Marxist-Leninism in Russia, or Maoism in China, or Fidel Castro's little thing in Cuba. But in North Korea, they have this thing called Juche, spelled Juchy. It's fascinating. It's like this communist but incredibly nationalist ideology, which is a really interesting blend of prosperity in the state and belief in the state and allegiance to the state and the single leader. And of course they make a cult of personality out of Kim Jong-un and all his two other predecessors. But it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see communism intertwined with other ethnic cultures, because you look at Korea and you end up with a Juche, and you look at China and you end up with Maoism, and then you look at how it was done in Eastern Germany, and it's bizarre and somewhat fascinating how communism, how like totalitarian communism can kind of then preserve how totalitarian communism can preserve like conservative realms of culture. Because if you look at East and West Germany, after they were divided after the end of World War II, the West became quite progressive and quite liberal, and of course economically successful. But then their culture, like music and singing and literature, I don't know why I divided singing and music, and philosophy and thought and politics and intellectuals and academics, it all became very progressive. And it wasn't that tradition and culture was trashed, of course it wasn't, but it moved on, and not as much traditional culture was preserved of West Germany, at least to my understanding. I'm not German, so if there are some Germans watching this, please correct me. But if you look at then East Germany, because of that proud nation-state concept blended with the ideas of communism, it kind of preserved Germanic heritage in a bizarre way. So you would, the classical greats of Germany were conserved, and you would go to piano lessons, and the opera and the orchestra and traditional Germanic literature, all with this socialist twist. So bizarre. So fascinating. Anyway, Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe. I'll talk about what I know of her. She, of course, is a very beautiful lady. She was an entertainer, a celebrity personality, probably one of the most famous women in the world, to be completely honest with you. Married to several men, lots and lots of affairs, lived in America, of course. I don't know almost anything about her upbringing or where she came from, but I do know that she was a film star. I'm not even sure if she did any like music, if she was a singer or not. She might have been, but I know her mostly as a film star, and she became a cultural icon of 60s, 50s America. It's quite fascinating. And of course, her death is very mysterious, because she had numerous affairs with numerous high-order people, including Arthur Miller, again, the guy who wrote The Crucible. So Arthur Miller actually married Marilyn Monroe, which I was gobsmacked when I found that out. Arthur Miller married Marilyn Monroe, and it was because Marilyn Monroe had been in showbiz, and it had been very hectic. It had been she didn't enjoy it. She was, I mean, as showbiz was, there was the pressure, there was the celebrity status, there was the media, there was, just as media was expanding into its new realm, which we see it in today, there was the drugs and the sex and the rock and roll and all, and that was just a bit too much for her, and she wanted a quiet, normal family life. And so she met Arthur Miller. I forget how. I forget how. But they met, and then they had an affair for 2 years, and then Arthur Miller split up with his wife, and then they married. And Arthur Miller was, I'm not sure if he was completely Jewish, but he had Jewish origins, and so Marilyn Monroe actually converted to Judaism in order to marry Arthur Miller. And I think they were married for about 2 to 4 years, 3 or 4 years, I think. And it started off well, but it didn't end well. I think Marilyn Monroe heavily enjoyed working around the house and helping out Arthur Miller and living out this perceived normal lifestyle which she'd conceived. And she quite enjoyed that. But then I think, I'm not sure where it came, but eventually she had to start taking drugs to go to sleep, and she was still in the showbiz arena, and the pressure was just getting more and more and more. And then Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller decided to work on a film script together, and Arthur Miller wrote the script for the film, and then Marilyn Monroe was going to star in it, and then they were arguing all throughout the process and everything, and it was just not going well. And then I think they divorced before the movie was released, and then the movie was released, and then she died soon after. It was horrible. And I think the official saying for the death of Marilyn Monroe was what was it? Like a drug overdose, because it related to drugs. But there are countless and countless conspiracy theories of the murder of Marilyn Monroe. Apparently Frank Sinatra pops up at some time. He might have something to do with it. But, the basic line is that she knew too much because she was sleeping with too many high-profile guys, like JFK, for example. They had a thing, apparently. And yeah, someone needed her killed, and she was killed. That's how the mainstream, that's how the conspiracy theory goes. We'll probably never know, to be completely honest. But there you go. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was not even the first verse. That was the first half of the first verse. Harry Truman, Doris Day, Red China, Johnny Ray, South Pacific, Walter Winchell, Joe DiMaggio, Joe McCarthy, Richard Nixon, Studebaker Television, North Korea, South Korea, Marilyn Monroe. So that was 38 minutes. So I think I'm going to have to separate this into several episodes, because it would become incredibly boring. Yeah, this will be part 1 of several parts for the first read-through, and then the second read-through I will have done my research. Tune in again at another time. Yeah. See you then.